Let's first of all get our facts straight because unfortunately, the American people, and I think many Europeans, certainly in Western Europe, but not exclusively, Europe in general, have been fed a lot of information that is simply false. The Russians were goaded by us for years over Ukraine, and they finally said enough's enough, and they intervened. They intervened because we were building a force in eastern Ukraine designed to attack Russia. And we had installed a puppet regime in Kiev that was brought to power by the CIA. And we then capitalized on whatever hostility we could cultivate in Ukraine. And the outcome is this terrible war, which the Ukrainians have lost. The war is a catastrophe for Europe, but especially for the people of Ukraine. We now know that at least 600,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed in less than 3 years. Those are World War I levels of loss. This is something that we did not see in the short period of time, this kind of devastation, even during World War II.
As Colonel Douglas Macgregor outlined, the real tragedy here is the extent to which misinformation has fueled this conflict. We've seen it time and time again, a narrative carefully crafted to justify actions that would otherwise be indefensible. But when the veil is lifted, the reality becomes clear. This war was avoidable, and it has become a catastrophe, not just for Ukraine but for Europe as a whole. Let's break down the numbers. Over 600,000 Ukrainian soldiers have lost their lives in a conflict that has dragged on for nearly 3 years. These aren't just numbers on a page. These are real people, families torn apart, entire generations wiped out. To put it in perspective, Macgregor's comparison to World War I isn't an exaggeration. The scale of loss is staggering, and it should force us to stop and think. How did we get here? The roots of this conflict run deep. For years, the United States and its allies played a dangerous game, goading Russia, escalating tensions, and pushing Ukraine into a role it was never equipped to play. Ukraine, a nation with deep historical ties to Russia, was turned into a geopolitical chess piece with devastating consequences. And the puppet regime in Kiev? A creation of Western intervention designed not to protect Ukraine's interests, but to serve broader Western geopolitical ambitions. But where does that leave the Ukrainian people? Caught in the middle of a conflict that has ravaged their country. The devastation isn't just on the battlefield. Ukrainian cities have been reduced to rubble. The economy, once fragile but functional, is now in shambles. Basic infrastructure has collapsed, and millions of Ukrainians have fled, seeking refuge wherever they can find it. The real question we must ask is, why? Why was this conflict allowed to spiral out of control? Why was Ukraine set up to fail in a war it could never win? Macgregor's comments point to a larger issue, the West's hubris. For years, Western leaders have operated under the assumption that they could push Russia into a corner, that they could manipulate events in Eastern Europe without facing serious consequences. But as history has shown, time and time again, Russia is not a country that backs down easily. Its response was not just predictable, it was inevitable. And yet, Western leaders continue to feign surprise. They act as though this war was an unforeseeable tragedy, when in fact, it was the direct result of years of reckless foreign policy. A policy that ignored Russia's legitimate security concerns while fanning the flames of nationalism and militarism in Ukraine. As we stand here today, the war in Ukraine is dragging on with no end in sight. Western media, for the most part, remains focused on portraying Ukraine as the victim and Russia as the aggressor. But is that really the whole story? Or is it possible that both sides have been manipulated by forces beyond their control? The puppet regime in Kiev, as Macgregor pointed out, was never truly in charge. From the moment it was installed, it became a proxy for larger Western interests. And those interests were never about protecting Ukraine. They were about destabilizing Russia. It was a gamble, one that has cost hundreds of thousands of lives and thrown Europe into chaos. But what about Europe itself? Europe is now facing the fallout of a war it neither wanted nor needed. The The refugee crisis is just one symptom of the larger disaster. Economies across the continent are suffering, energy prices are soaring, and political instability is growing. Europe, once a symbol of peace and prosperity, is now at the mercy of forces far beyond its control. As Macgregor hinted, the real winners here aren't in Kiev, or Moscow, or even Brussels. The real winners are those who benefit from endless conflict, the military-industrial complexes that profit from war, the political elites who use fear and division to maintain power. And the losers? The ordinary people, the soldiers on both sides, the families torn apart by violence, the nations left in ruins. So, where do we go from here? Can this war be stopped? Or are we doomed to watch it spiral further out of control? Macgregor's analysis gives us a starting point. We need to step back and reassess our approach to this conflict. We need to stop viewing it through the lens of us versus them, East versus West, and start looking at the human cost. We need to understand that the real tragedy here is not who wins or loses, but the fact that this war was allowed to happen in the first place. In the end, it's not just about Ukraine. It's about the future of Europe, the future of international relations, and most importantly, the future of peace. We cannot afford to let this conflict continue to escalate. It's time for cooler heads to prevail. It's time for diplomacy to take center stage. Because if we don't, the cost will only continue to rise, and the world may find itself facing consequences far worse than we ever imagined. Stay informed, stay critical, and don't forget to comment. Thank you for watching. According to Douglas Macgregor, the American people, and I think many Europeans, especially in Western Europe, have been fed a lot of information that's simply false. The Russians were goaded by us for years over Ukraine, and they finally said enough's enough, and they intervened. They intervened because we were building a force in eastern Ukraine designed to attack Russia, and we installed a puppet regime in Kiev that was brought to power by the CIA. The outcome is this terrible war, which the Ukrainians have lost. The war is a catastrophe for Europe, but especially for the people of Ukraine. We now know that at least 600,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died in less than 3 years. Those are World War I levels of loss. Do you agree with Douglas Macgregor? Drop comment below. Thanks for watching.